Now, the question for Europe is this. You rely on the US for your defense, for your security, NATO, the transatlantic alliance. And what happens if the US turns inwards? Does this mean that you no longer have a foundation for European Union? I was in the Quad group at the time. Xi Jinping, of course, brought his 52% Mao Tai from Guizhou. Ma Ying-jeou, not to be outdone, brought his 52% Jingwen Gaoliang. You can talk about intellectual property, you can talk about chips. I think the Chinese can look after themselves. But on Taiwan, they will go to war.
喺睇片之前，大家記得分享、讚好同訂閱灼見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁你就唔會錯過我哋嘅最新影片。
The idea that American fleets should be in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, in the South China Sea, in the Sea of Okhotsk, wherever, they think, well, you can do that because you have the capability, but it costs you a fortune. And you can only do it now because you have the US dollar and the exorbitant privilege which comes to the US dollar. Now, remember in the 60s, the Vietnam War, which was very expensive. And Johnson wanted to carry on with his Great Society program. So in the end, the US dollar had to be depegged from gold, and it led to horrifying inflation, which Paul Volcker later had to squeeze out at horrible pain to the entire world. They don't want to do that. In fact, in my view, they will never open the domestic capital market fully to London and New York. Because you do that, you lose control of monetary policy within the country. And China have always this belief that to preserve its homogeneity, and it's 92% Han, to preserve its homogeneity, you must always build walls around yourself. It can be a physical wall, it can be a capital markets wall, it can be a wall on Hollywood movies, on textbooks, and the most remarkable war of all, in recent years, a biological wall that they built. You know, in the national anthem, which they sing every day, they talk about rebuilding walls. The Americans don't know this. They think that, like themselves, the Chinese are also a proselytizing missionary power. The Americans, when they come to Asia, sometimes it's cynical, but usually it's sincere. Their wish is for you to become like them. And they kept lecturing Lee Kuan Yew. He got so exasperated. So he said, make me a 51st state, and I'll follow your instructions. Then you look after me, you look after my defense. Now, the question for Europe is this. You rely on the US for your defense, for your security. NATO, the transatlantic alliance. Is the EU, is that the foundation of the EU? Well, it's a big question in the future of Europe. What is European autonomy? It's not 1 or 0, but in which direction do you want to move? And what happens if the US turns inwards? Does this mean that you no longer have a foundation for European Union? So these are big issues. And the position Europe takes in the world will have a big bearing on whether we have peace or war between the US and China. Because if Europe, because of the transatlantic alliance, follows US policy on issues vital to China, particularly Taiwan, the likelihood of war goes up. But if Europe says, look, on these issues we agree with you because we are from the same civilization, but on those issues, no, then the Americans will be more circumspect and war becomes less likely. Because it's not triangular. It is bipolar with Europe somewhere at the fulcrum. And it can lean a little more to one side or the other and maintain stability. And if Europe does that, the transition to a multipolar world will be a much smoother one. But to do that, you need knowledge. It cannot be just the result of domestic electoral necessities. It cannot be the whim of political leaders who have no sense of history and little understanding of it. You need scholars, you need think tanks, you need Jesuits. This is very important because on the other side, they have their counterparts. And Taiwan is an issue so lightly played that is alarming to me. How European leaders, European countries say, oh, no, we love Taiwanese, we love Taiwan. They know nothing about Taiwan, but they love Taiwan. And they love to visit Taiwan, even though they can't remember the names and the places they visit. They do that in order to support the Americans and to satisfy themselves that they are being tough with China. Because China is too big, we've got to show that we are also strong. But Taiwan is a wrong card to play, because for the Chinese, Taiwan is a matter of historical justice. In the 1943 December, in Cairo, Stalin met Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek. And in the Cairo Declaration, they make clear that Taiwan will be returned to China. In Potsdam, after the war ended in Europe, July 1945, it was Truman, and then halfway Churchill was replaced by Attlee because he had lost the elections in the UK, and Stalin. And they reaffirmed the Cairo Declaration in the Potsdam Proclamation. In other words, the status of Taiwan was long settled. During the Civil War in China, the American Navy helped the KMT to occupy islands in the South China Sea because the US accepted that those islands were part of China. They were occupied by Japan as a part of China, and so we returned to China. But now, because China is a preoccupation, many issues are being revisited, despite the history. But for the Chinese, Taiwan was lost because their fleet was sunk by Japan in 1994. And there was a humiliating peace agreement called the Treaty of Shimonoseki that year, leading to Japan taking over Taiwan and ruling it for 50 years. For China, it is not an issue which is negotiable. And any Chinese leader who takes a different position, however autocratic, will lose the overwhelming support of the Chinese people. Now, other issues you can talk about. You can talk about trade, you can talk about intellectual property, you can talk about chips. I think the Chinese can look after themselves. But on Taiwan, they will go to war. If they believe that the US intends to keep Taiwan separate, independent if possible, forever. The accusation is made that China is about to invade Taiwan, that Xi Jinping wants to do it for his legacy. This will not explain why in 2015 in Singapore, Xi Jinping, 2 years after he became president, met Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan in Singapore, as an equal. It was never done before. It was unprecedented. And it was done at great risk to himself. They had dinner at the Shangri-La Hotel. I was in the Quad group at the time, so I asked, who paid for the bill? I was told 50-50, down to the last cent, 50-50. Xi Jinping, of course, brought his 52% Mao Tai from Guizhou. Ma Ying-jeou, not to be outdone, brought his 52% Jingmen Gaoliang. Both very good liquors and very warm words exchanged. Now, Xi Jinping was not doing it for Ma Ying-jeou because Ma Ying-jeou was stepping down. he was doing it for Tsai Ing-wen, whom everybody knew would be the next president. I called on Tsai Ing-wen after she was elected, before she was installed. And she grumbled that the mainland was not forthcoming. I said, but Xi Jinping has just opened a road for you. It's not a superhighway, but it's a pretty good road. She kept quiet. She knew what I meant. But she would not take that road because even though she became president on the Constitution of the Republic of China, her own party constitution of the DPP, the first article says, our mission is to establish an independent Republic of Taiwan. So when Western powers lightly encourage the DPP to flirt with independence, you're touching a live wire. It will have consequences. So while I do not believe that China wants to invade Taiwan lightly, I believe that China will move if they are convinced that Taiwan has embarked on the road to independence. China cannot abjure the use of force, any more than Madrid can abjure the use of force if Catalonia were to declare independence unilaterally. Any more than London can abjure the use of force if Scotland were to declare independence unilaterally, or even Northern Ireland. But because you do not abjure the use of force, so we can be polite to one another and negotiate peaceful outcomes. But the mood in the Western media, partly deliberate, partly reflecting the mores of the time, is to paint a picture of China which is very dramatic and very black, and is leading to wrong decisions being taken in Europe. And yet the decisions being taken in Europe will have huge consequences for the world, and of course, for Europe itself. So Alex, let me end here, and then we can have a conversation. And the Russian Foreign Ministry remembers me not for my work in the Trade Ministry or Foreign Ministry, but for my work in helping them establish a church in Singapore. So culture touches people the most deeply. They'll forget everything else, which is increasingly what Americans are telling us, that America's enemies are our enemies. And the use of long-arm jurisdiction, which is causing a lot of angst all over the world and leading to de-dollarization. But there is a big difference between the way China handles Southeast Asia with the way the US handles Southeast Asia.
中意名家分析，記得俾 like 同埋分享，支持同訂閱卓見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁就唔會錯過我哋嘅新片。